In the year 2667, pilot J. Kurt J. relaxed in his seat when his ship made the jump to slip space. When he was beyond Veru, near the outer edge of the system, however, his thoughts lingered on the station and the militia he left behind. His mind was still a mess and incoherent. It was all still a fog to him. He entered the station, tried to meet with security, then boom. Did we not have enough time? I swore we had more than enough time, Jay thought to himself. He ran the scene in his head multiple times. They landed, he grabbed some food to go, and rushed over to the Mantis security offices. The route from his ship to the security office was no more than 10 minutes if he ran, 25 if you walked it. Jay, Cam, called from behind. Are you good? Jay ignored him and shook his head. He choked. I thought we had more time. What do you mean, Jay? What's wrong? Cam pleaded for an answer. Jay gave in and reluctantly pressed the button to have his seat finally turn and face Cam. Cam was dirty, and the previously fried communications component sat at his desk, broken. Evidence pointed toward its manual repair, but nonetheless, he was worried about Jay's state of mind. It's my fault, Cam, he uttered. I thought we had more than enough time, but security took their sweet time. Next thing I knew, the station was being blown to dust. Cam tried to comfort Jay, but he shoved away his advance, averting his eyes from him. He handed the data drive back to Cam, who secured it in a reinforced data slot beside his station. There were a series of racks filled with similar data drives, but Cam taped the side that was exposed and wrote on it the type of content that resided within it. Don't worry, Cam said in a low tone. Once we reach Alam, I'm sure the stellar fleet will help those on Draxus. He returned to his desk and began to work on a damaged communications component sustained from their earlier encounter. Jay kept those words close and was the first to retire to his bunk, the most recent event now haunting him. Several hours passed, and Jay awoke from his stiff slumber and looked around the cabin. Cam was seen dozing off at his station as he did his best to stay awake, but with a tap of his shoulder, he silently made his way to his bunk. Jay returned to the cockpit, taking an undamaged burrito from the station prior from his pouch and began to eat. He hated rations and would rather opt for station food instead. The thought of the shop owner raced in his mind, souring the thought of the meal. He thus returned to his seat and noted that the communication component that was previously at Cam's desk was no longer there. He peered at the rear of the ship and noticed the panel it belonged to was shut and secure. He turned the chair around and began a series of ship diagnostics and searched for the communications tab and ran a test. Several moments passed by, and he was greeted by a pleasant ding. While he couldn't do long-range inter-system communications, he had the majority of capabilities for in-system communications. He looked back once again to Cam and silently thanked him for his hard work and kept it at that. 6 hours had elapsed, and there were 4 hours left into their jump. Jay continued his silent contemplation into the swirling void before him. Again, hues of purple and blue dominated the view with an electric display of white that caressed the edges of the two previous colors. He was entranced. He let his mind slip and finally succumbed to a second dose of sleep, this time only lightly. When Jay came to, he heard the tapping of keys behind him, and when he turned, Cam was awake, working at his station. Jay wanted to speak to him, but he couldn't. He instead turned his head forward and viewed the unending whirl of faster-than-light travel. He peeked at a timer that sat in the top left corner of the cockpit and designated that he had roughly 30 minutes until they would exit slip space. He analyzed the next system on his holo map that was generated in front of him, albeit a small form factor of the much larger ones on the bigger ships, and the light blue hue generated from the display lit up his portion of the ship. The system they were about to enter was called Altia. In terms of distance, it was farther to Draxus than Dima was by a few light-years and was a much larger population than all of Draxus by about 200 million people. As one of the few stops on the edge of known Terran space, it had a great presence of a mix of militia and sleuth of private security. There was also a fleet liaison station present in the system that housed itself on one of the smaller mountainous moons of the central colony, Alta. The system was large with several other planets beside Altia that could sustain life, albeit at a lower rate. It had a total of 3 planets close to the Sun that all were capable of life since their locations all shared the Goldilocks zone. In order, it went Ra, Altia, Alai. Beyond them were 2 insignificant planets reduced to mining colonies, Fora and Fling. It had in its possession an asteroid belt, but after years of vigorous mining had reduced it to a fraction of its original size since the system's founding. Then beyond that were 3 gas giants and their plentiful moons, Gilia, Hai, and Flavin. Those gas giants and their moons operated as a training area for militia and security pilots as well as a vast collection of research centers that belonged to many corporate entities as well as some belonging to the Stellar Command. Their presence alone was his only hope, and the fact that they operated near the farthest planet, Flavin, which by the time they exited slip space would be oriented closest to his exit point. As they left slip space, Jay reached for several switches in a practiced motion and flipped them in a sequential order essential for operation. He tapped on the display that housed communications and input a sequence of numbers. After testing that it worked, he began broadcasting on a wide frequency on all bands. Emergency. This is Star Runner 4311, pilot JCT, broadcasting to any military or authority vessel. We have news of an attack on Draxus from an unknown party. Over. With no immediate response, he felt that perhaps the short-range comms were still broken. He tried calling many more times before simply looping the message. He expanded his already limited range of frequency and proceeded to manually advance toward the closest fleet-affiliated outpost, still broadcasting his message. He spooled for a slipstream jump, and just before it was charged, his ship rocked and his shields flickered before ultimately fading from existence. What happened? Jay yelled. I don't know, but we weren't locked. We don't have shields. Cam replied. Cam manipulated his screens and provided maximum power to the power core and diverted some of their thrust to shields to try to increase their regeneration. Jay instead began evasive maneuvers from an unseen enemy, but when shots flew wide from his rear, he reoriented his ship and began facing toward the shots, doing his best to make his ship unpredictable to lead. However, that tactic failed as his ship held no weapons. Whatever shields the ship regenerated were depleted in the initial run. The ships flew past each other. Jay was able to glance at its silhouette. It was a slim-looking ship and larger than his own. It sported a dead green luster with a series of black markings on it. It was angular with overt curves on the spine and bottom of the craft. The frame of the angles tapered toward the front, giving the overhead cross-section a look of an elongated trapezoid. He circled his ship in a reckless maneuver, and the two found themselves headlong towards each other, but Jay accelerated whatever he had left on his throttle to max and sped away. In the time it took for the enemy craft to circle back and train his sights on Jay, he was already too far, at least that's what he thought. He looked at the radar and noticed that there was no signature, but his ship rocked once more with accurate shots of the enemy. With a ping on his radar, the signature of the enemy revealed it to be much closer than he believed. An alarm rang, and an indicator for a missile appeared on his visor. When it was close, he popped his flares, and a series of thumps erupted from the ship, and an explosion rang out from behind. The concussion still shaking his ship, he thought he was clear as he sped away, but in a split second, the icon for incoming missile flashed, and his ship was hit. The ship spiraled out of control, and Jay found himself fighting for control. When he did so, a fire erupted in the cabin, and Cam tried to fight it, his once shattered helmet refitted with shoddy repairs atop his head. When vying for control and still under ever-slowing acceleration, shots passed the ship wide and tracked toward his ship, and when the red projectiles vanished, the ship rocked once more. This time, spelling the end of their acceleration. Now his ship was at the mercy of inertia. Jay looked for a solution, only to be met with grim failure, except for one. Jay resolved himself and sequenced for a timed scuttle of his ship, and a timer of 3 minutes appeared on one of the numerous cockpit displays. He removed himself from his seat and approached the firefighting Cam. Cam! We have to go now. A look of worry and fear on his friend's face. The ship is time to blow. Grab the drive and prepare to jump. A moment of clarity came across Cam, and he scrambled to depart the drive from its slot. At first, he struggled because the mechanism for it was jammed. He grabbed one of his numerous tools to forcibly eject the drive, which was successful, and prepared his personal tank of oxygen, same as Jay. Jay opened the door, and with Cam behind him, jumped. The ship they left behind continued on, and they fell behind the concealment of debris and smoke before his ship ultimately detonated. The ship that once trailed them flew past them toward the remains of his ship and ultimately left upon the end of its investigation. When he thought they were safe, a pained scream erupted from Cam. When he turned, Cam's face was pained, and when Jay asked what was wrong, he pointed to his back. The canister for his oxygen was venting at a rapid pace, and so was part of his visor. Blood also erupted from the wound, and a piece of metal the size of his hand was lodged in his spine. Fear and worry overtook him. He looked desperately on his person and on Cam's for a solution but found none that would help. As he continued looking, the weakened Cam put his hand on Jay, prompting him to stop. "I'm sorry," he started weakly, using what oxygen he had left to issue a final request. "I should have done more. Please find Alexandria. Make sure she's safe." Cam's eyes lost their light, and his skin turned blue, then ultimately pale white. He felt a bump on his chest and noticed it was his friend's hand. In it was the drive and a portable distress beacon attached. It was Cam's last act. Jay returned in kind and held him, noticing as he did so that his friend's eyes closed for an eternal slumber. Jay wanted to cry one last time but knew if he did so, all his oxygen would be wasted. Instead, he buckled down and held what little composure he had. Drifting in the endless void of space, he drifted into space for several minutes when he noticed a glare in the corner of his visor. He turned, and what he thought to be his savior was the same ship that had chased them into the Altia system. Anger arose in him, but he knew he could do nothing out here. The ship slowed and oriented itself so that the rear faced Jay. The rear was smooth with a circular portion of the rear he thought to be the entrance. He wished he had a sidearm to empty into the first soul that opened those doors but relinquished the thought as it moved closer. The doors opened, and two silhouettes appeared in black, a contrast to the white-gray interior and the light that reflected on its surfaces. They inched closer, preparing to retrieve him and most likely leave his friend to the mercy of the void, lost to time. They were no more than 15 or so meters before the actions of his captors grew rancid and fearful. It looked like they wanted to expedite the process, and the ship began moving closer at a faster pace. However, their efforts ended as quickly as they started. A piercing light of blue found its way into the upper hull of their ship with a brilliant shatter of their shields, with melted slag peering from its edges, followed by a burst of green flames. Another round found its mark, this time arcing its way from above Jay into the open compartment, rendering one being completely obliterated and the other without an arm. Of course, the round continued on and found its mark through the center of the ship. It jolted forward and clumsily moved away erratically, veering direction with an unintended course. Flames were already enveloping the ship, but a third shot found its mark true, and the ship exploded in its failed getaway. Jay wanted to turn to meet his savior, but he was already running low on oxygen, and his eyes began to feel heavy. However, his curiosity and his fear were alleviated when a ship sporting steel gray and navy blue came before him. Its rear ramp opened, and the familiar uniform of the Navy appeared. Before they could bring him into the ship, his eyes closed, no longer able to keep their contact with his saviors. Distress Beacon Inquiry to TRSC Sword of Reckoning, Vice Admiral Wolf, from TRSC Maiden of Blue, Commander Ware. Good afternoon, sir. We received a distress beacon from the Altia system while on patrol near Oliver Research Station. It was unusual, as most of our communications were down that we chalked up for repairs. Turns out the distress beacon we picked up was transmitting in Delta band, and it was the only source to go by. The initial distress call reported news of an attack on Draxus by an unknown entity. Upon reaching the location of the source, it died, and we were left with a simple coordinate beacon, the ones used for personnel. We've secured the two, but one suffered fragment injuries and succumbed to his injuries before we found them. The sole survivor is a JCT, and in his possession was a data drive labeled Dimma Draxus Attack. We took the liberty of reviewing the contents, and they are evidence of an attack on the outer colonies, requesting mobilization of 7th Fleet. Documents are attached. Very respectfully. Commander Ware. TRSC Maiden of Blue. Ending transmission. Sending attachments.